After completing this course, you should be able to discuss Brocade via vrouter deployment options, download vrouter software, create a bootable live CD using Windows or Linux, install the software using an ISO image or a virtual machine template, verify correct installation of the vrouter, upgrade a vrouter, and reboot and shut down the vrouter. We'll begin by looking at options for deploying the vrouter. vrouter can be installed on any x86-based 32-bit or 64-bit platform. You can install vrouter as the only operating system on a system, often called a bare metal installation. When installed this way, you are creating a dedicated vrouter device, similar to other dedicated networking platforms. You can also install vrouter as a virtual appliance. When installed this way, the vrouter shares system resources with other virtual appliances, with resource allocation managed by a hypervisor platform running as the underlying operating system. Brocade provides several pre-configured virtual machine templates for several different hypervisor platforms. We also have a generic virtualized installation image that uses an install procedure similar to a bare metal installation. To download vrouter software, point your browser at www.vrouter.com. Click on the Support tab, then select Support Portal. You'll be redirected to the vrouter support website. Enter your support login and password, then click on Download Software to access the image files. The file or files you need for vrouter depend on the platform you're installing to. Make sure you download the correct files. The file name includes either the keyword live CD or the name of a hypervisor. Live CD files end with .iso. Hypervisor templates end with an extension appropriate for the particular hypervisor. For example, a VMware file will end with .ovf. The version number is the vrouter software version, for example 6.6. Release numbers are also included here. Know that if you have purchased the Amazon AMI, access to a pre-installed vrouter is available through your Amazon Web Services account. You don't need to download any software. If you are doing a bare metal installation or using the generic virtualized installer, you need to create a bootable CD using the ISO file you downloaded. This is not the same as simply copying the files to a CD. Likewise, you don't want to create or generate an ISO. The file is already an ISO image. You can use any disk creation software. Look for an option to burn image or something similar. If you are installing one of the pre-configured templates to a hypervisor, follow the hypervisor instructions for copying the template to the hypervisor management system. We'll first look at creating a virtual vrouter using the template you just copied to your hypervisor. Because Brocade supports so many different hypervisor platforms, covering individual details of each one is beyond the scope of this course. Refer to the documentation for your platform for the exact commands or menu paths needed to complete these steps. Remember that the file you downloaded is a vrouter template, not an actual vrouter. You can modify this template to provide a standard virtual hardware setup, then use the template to create as many individual virtual routers as you have licensed. Think of this step as specifying a standard hardware build for use in your network. The most common template modification is adding Ethernet interfaces. The vrouter template only includes a single Ethernet interface by default. Since most routers use at least 2 interfaces, you can simplify device rollouts by adding the interfaces to the template rather than to each individual virtual machine. Other options you may want to modify include changing the default disk space allocation and memory allocation. For example, if you're planning to do extensive on-system logging, you may need additional disk space. If you're planning to use your vrouter to handle a full BGP feed, you may need more system memory. Your next step is to use the template to create a vrouter virtual machine. During this process, you can modify the individual vrouter settings, including adding or removing interfaces, assigning interfaces to the appropriate physical interface or hypervisor virtual network, adding memory, or adding disk space. These changes will only apply to this virtual machine instance and will not modify the template. The VM creation process usually ends by booting up your new virtual machine. If it does not, you can start the virtual machine manually. If you're installing to bare metal, or if you're using the generic virtualization build, you need to use the installation script. The script is not needed for template-based virtual installs. If you want to install using the ISO disk and installation script, you need to make sure your hardware platform or virtual machine meets the following requirements. You should have a minimum of 512 megabytes of RAM and a minimum of 2 gigabytes of disk space. Additionally, you should install all networking ports prior to installing the vrouter. This includes installing all physical Ethernet ports and modifying the virtual machine to add additional virtual interfaces. If you're installing to bare metal, you may need to change the BIOS settings on your hardware so that the CD-ROM drive is first in the boot order. Access to the BIOS is usually achieved by pressing a specific function key at a particular point in the boot sequence. Consult your hardware manual for the right key to use. When you're finished setting the boot order, be sure to save the new BIOS configuration before exiting. If you are installing a VM directly from the ISO image, you need to create that generic Linux virtual machine. This will allocate the appropriate basic system resources for the virtual machine. Next, you'll boot your generic Linux virtual machine from the ISO. You can do this in one of two ways. Copy the ISO to a directory on the hypervisor, then have the Linux virtual machine mount the ISO as a CD-ROM at boot up, or you can set the Linux virtual machine to boot from the local physical CD drive. When boot up is complete, the system will display the login prompt. You'll next need to log in using the default username and password of vrouter. For security reasons, the system won't display anything when you type your password. You're now in the vrouter CLI. At the prompt, type the command install system and press enter. The installation script will ask a series of questions as it configures the software to suit your individual hardware situation. Suggested answers are displayed in square brackets. We recommend accepting the suggested values unless you have a good reason to do otherwise. The first thing the installation script does is look for available disks to which it can install the software. If you have multiple drives, you can choose to have the installation script set them up in a RAID array, or you can opt to install the software to just one of the available drives. If you answer no, or if you have a single hard drive, the system prompts you to determine how you'd like to perform the partitioning of your drive. Unless you have experience using PartEd, you should use the auto option here. Next, select the destination drive for vrouter. If you have only one drive, that drive name will appear in the list. If you have multiple drives, make sure you enter the correct drive name at the prompt. In this example, the device SDB is a removable flash device. We could install vrouter to this device, so we enter SDB at the prompt. However, we're installing to the local hard drive, so we accept the default value of SDA and continue. Note the warning, the installer will erase the entire contents of the specified drive. Next, set the partition size. Normally, you'll use the entire drive for the vrouter operating system, and this is the default. If you wanted to use part of the drive for other purposes, for example, that removable flash device where you want to store other files, you could specify a different size. Next, the script installs the vrouter system. When it finishes, you'll be prompted to select a configuration file to load. You should accept the default. The next step is to set the password for the administrator account. The default administrator username is vrouter. Enter the password you want to use for this account. The password will not appear as you type. Note that for security reasons, we recommend that you do not use the word vrouter as a password. The default combination of vrouter for both username and password is well known and can make your system vulnerable. In some releases of vrouter, we actually block you from using vrouter as a password. The next step is to install the Grub bootloader. A bootloader is the first software program that runs when a computer starts. It is responsible for loading and transferring control to the operating system kernel software. The kernel, in turn, initializes the rest of the operating system. The bootloader for Linux is called Grub, which stands for Grand Universal Bootloader. The installation script will prompt you for the name of the boot drive. Usually, this is the same drive as the one you just used to hold the system software. Installing Grub is the last installation step. When it's complete, the system returns to the CLI prompt. You can now remove the live CD, either eject it or reset your virtual machine to boot from the hard drive, then reboot your new system. Before we continue, let's take a break to answer some questions on the information you've just learned. These questions are designed to reinforce key points from the training, and we're not collecting any quiz scores. Before you begin configuring your vrouter, you should perform a few simple checks to verify that the installation completed successfully. The first step in verifying your installation is to log in using the device administrator account. The username is vrouter, and the password is whatever you set during the installation process. If your installation is successful and you type the password correctly, you will see the CLI prompt. Next, verify the version and boot source information. Type the command show version at the CLI prompt. The show version command will respond with several pieces of important information. First, check the software version and verify that it is what you expect it to be, in this case, Subscription Edition 6.4. Next, look at the line that reads Boot Via and verify that the system has been booted from the local disk image. A common installation mistake is to forget to remove the live CD from the CD-ROM drive after installing. If that's the case, the Boot Via line will read Live CD. If that happens, don't worry. Just remove the live CD from the CD drive and reboot the system. Then restart the verification process. The next step is to verify that the installation process discovered all the installed interfaces. Enter the command show configuration. Use the spacebar if you see the More prompt until you see the Interfaces section of the configuration. Ethernet interfaces are identified as ETH followed by the interface number. If an interface is not listed, it means that the vrouter did not detect it when it booted. You will need to troubleshoot your hardware installation. Troubleshooting hardware is beyond the scope of this course. If you are using a virtual machine, you need to not only make sure that the vrouter found all your interfaces, but you need to match the hardware ID in the vrouter configuration with the MAC address device mapping in the hypervisor. If the hypervisor device number does not line up with the desired vrouter interface, you can reconfigure the hardware ID within the vrouter software. Next, we'll discuss the software upgrade process. To upgrade your vrouter, enter the command Upgrade System Image at the operational mode prompt. This command automatically downloads the latest software image and modifies the configuration file to associate it with the new software version. In order to check the vrouter repository, your device must have an active connection to the Internet. You also need your repository username and password. You can manually enter this during the upgrade process, or you can pre-configure your credentials as part of your system configuration. Upgrading a virtual machine is a bit more complex. A vrouter virtual machine template has two major components, the vrouter software itself and the underlying Linux drivers, system, hypervisor-specific optimization, and so on. When Brocade releases a vrouter update, you may or may not need to update the underlying system template, depending on Linux updates, driver updates, and so on. Rather than having to look this up yourself, the Upgrade System Image command takes care of this for you. It will check for both a new version of the vrouter software, but will also check whether the underlying template needs to be updated. When you run the Upgrade System Image command, the software first checks to see if the vrouter is a virtual machine. If it is, then the software will check the vrouter repository to see if the new vrouter image requires a new underlying template. If it does, the system will display a message telling you that you must perform a manual upgrade. This ensures that your new vrouter software is running in the optimal virtual machine environment. If there's no new template, but there is a new vrouter image, then the image has been validated on the existing overall template. The system will prompt you to continue with the vrouter upgrade process, downloading the new software and copying it to disk. You can opt to reboot your system immediately or wait for a scheduled maintenance window to reboot to the new software image. If there's no new image, then the system displays a message saying that no new software is available and returns you to the operational prompt. Remember, Upgrade System Image command also works on bare metal vrouter installations. If the vrouter is not a virtual machine, the command skips the template check and just looks for a new system image. A manual upgrade is similar to creating a new VM with some additional steps. First, download the new template just as you did for your initial installation. Next, copy the configuration file from your existing virtual machine. You can use Secure Copy or FTP to copy it to an external server, or use a simple copy-paste from a console window. Next, edit the configuration file to remove the hardware-specific settings. We'll show you the details of what to remove on the next screen. Next, install a new virtual machine using the new template. When your new VM has booted up, copy your edited configuration file to /config/config.boot on the new system. This is the default configuration file for the vrouter device. Next, reboot your new VM. When it boots, it will read the hardware values from the hypervisor software and pull the rest of the configuration data from the configuration file you just copied over. Once your new VM is fully operational, you can cut over operations from the old VM. This cutover represents the only downtime your network will experience during the upgrade process and should be almost non-disruptive depending on your hypervisor software. As we said on the previous screen, you need to remove the hardware-specific information from the configuration file. Using any text editor, open the configuration file you saved and delete the hardware ID from the Ethernet interface configuration. Save the edited file, then copy it to the new VM once it is installed. We'll conclude with rebooting and shutting down the vrouter. To reboot the vrouter, simply type the command reboot at the CLI prompt. The default administrator, who has read-write access to the device, can reboot the system. Read-only administrators cannot reboot. You can also schedule the reboot to occur at some future time. The options are to enter a time, a day, or the keywords midnight or noon. To shut down the vrouter from either the console or from a remote management session, enter the power off command. You can schedule a future shutdown by entering the time and date you want the system to power off. When possible, you should always shut down the software before physically powering off a vrouter system. This ensures the most graceful closure of any open files. Before we continue, let's answer some more review questions.